I was not arrested so much as requested. The notice arrived on a seventh-day morning, slid into my ration queue between the nutrient paste voucher and the weekly devotional reminder. I almost missed it, just another slip of grey parchment in a life measured out in grey increments. But the paper was heavier than standard issue, the ink darker, and when I unfolded it, my hands left sweat marks on the edges. The language was polite, bureaucratic, and absolute. Citizen designation 7739 Sigma is hereby requested to report to Re-Educational Facility Secundus 7 for mandatory cognitive and spiritual realignment. Compliance is expected within 48 standard hours. Failure to comply will result in secondary enforcement measures. The Emperor protects. No crime specified. No charge listed. No explanation offered beyond those 3 clinical sentences, and a seal I didn't recognize, some subdivision of the Adeptus Arbites, or maybe the Ministorum, the stamp so faded I couldn't tell which saint's symbol was pressed into the wax. I told myself this was routine. An audit, perhaps. A clarification of records. The administratum was always finding errors in the vast ledgers of imperial citizenship, names misspelled, tithes miscounted, devotional attendance misrecorded. This would be a formality. I would sit in some grey office, answer questions about my work history, sign corrected documents, and return to my hab by evening shift. Still, the paper smelled of old ink and finality. I read it 3 more times, searching for details I'd missed, some clue about what had triggered this summons. My work record was exemplary, 12 years in the data processing sector, without a single disciplinary notation. My devotional attendance was logged and verified. My tithes were always paid on time, sometimes early. I had never joined any unofficial gatherings, never expressed seditious thoughts, never even lingered too long near prohibited sectors. I was invisible in the best possible way. I had made myself small and compliant and utterly unremarkable. And yet, here was the notice. I folded it carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of my work tunic, the paper warm against my chest like a second heartbeat. Around me, the ration queue moved forward with mechanical efficiency workers collecting their allotments, scanning their designation codes, moving on without conversation. No one met my eyes. That was normal. Eye contact invited connection, and connection invited scrutiny. But today, the avoidance felt deliberate, pointed. Had they already heard? Did they know I'd been summoned? Or was I imagining persecution where there was only the usual imperial indifference? I collected my rations, 7 days of nutrient paste, compressed protein wafers, and purified water in sealed containers, and returned to my hab through corridors that suddenly felt narrower than before. The lumen strips flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved wrong, and the air recyclers groaned with a sound like distant screaming. My hab was exactly as I'd left it that morning. A single room, 3 meters by 4, furnished with a cot, a data slate terminal, and a shelf holding my copy of the Imperial Infantryman's Uplifting Primer, the only book I was permitted to own. On the wall above my cot hung a small aquila stamped from cheap tin, the symbol of the Emperor's protection. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if it had failed me or if I had failed it. 48 hours. 2 days to prepare for something I didn't understand. I could have run. The thought occurred to me immediately. Visceral and desperate. The underhive was full of people who'd chosen oblivion over compliance, gangers, mutants, those who'd decided imperial justice was worse than imperial neglect. I could disappear into those depths, live by scavenging and theft, die anonymously in some forgotten tunnel, but running would confirm guilt I might not actually possess. Running would justify whatever suspicions had prompted the summons, and running required a courage I had carefully excised from myself years ago, when I'd learned that survival meant making yourself too boring to notice. So I packed instead. I owned almost nothing. The Imperium encouraged minimalism, attachment to possessions, suggested attachment to the material world, which led to hoarding, which led to corruption. I folded my 2 spare tunics, my prayer beads, my work gloves. I wrapped my tin aquila in cloth and placed it carefully in the center of my pack. I downloaded my work history onto a data wafer in case they needed verification. As I worked, I noticed my hands shaking. The notice hadn't said how long I would be gone. It hadn't mentioned whether I should arrange for someone to collect my rations or notify my work supervisor. The bureaucratic silence around those practical details felt intentional, as if the answer was obvious to everyone but me. I left my hab knowing I might never be officially accused of anything at all. The door sealed behind me with a hiss of pressurizing atmosphere, and I turned to look at the hab one last time. The number plate beside the entrance 7739 Sigma seemed dimmer than before, as if the lumen light had already begun erasing me. In the corridor, I passed other workers returning from their shifts. They moved like automatons, eyes forward, faces slack with exhaustion. Once, I would have been indistinguishable from them. Now I felt exposed, marked, as if the summons had branded itself across my forehead in letters only they could see. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going with a packed bag at an irregular hour. No one met my eyes. The transit station was 3 levels down, accessible via lifts that groaned and shuddered as they descended through the hive's infrastructure. I stood among 24 other citizens, all of us pressed shoulder to shoulder, breathing each other's recycled air. The woman beside me smelled like machine oil and chemical fear. The man in front of me had a barcode tattooed on his neck, a manufactorum worker. Probably, his designation permanent. I wondered if they'd been summoned too. I wondered if we were all traveling toward the same grey facility, the same polite erasure. The transit car arrived, a rusted container pulled by magnetic rails older than my grandparents. We filed in without speaking, arranged ourselves according to unspoken hierarchy. Workers near the doors, menials in the center, anyone of uncertain status pressed against the back wall where the smell of oil and ozone was strongest. I took my place in that uncertain space, gripping the overhead rail with one hand while my pack hung heavy from my shoulder. The car lurched forward, picking up speed as it traveled through tunnels carved from the hive's bedrock. Through the scratched viewport, I could see layers of city flashing past, residential blocks giving way to industrial zones, then administrative sectors marked by their cleaner walls and functioning lumen strips. Eventually, we descended below even those levels, into regions where the architecture grew older, more organic, the walls carved with symbols that predated the Imperium's arrival. No one looked at those symbols directly. Looking invited questions, and questions invited answers you didn't want to know. The transit announcement came in a voice that was more mechanical than human. Approaching re-educational facility Secundus 7. Designated passengers will disembark in 30 seconds. The Emperor protects. 5 of us stood. 5 out of 40 passengers, all of us moving toward the doors with the slow, inevitable motion of the condemned. The doors opened onto a platform that smelled of disinfectant and cold stone. Servo skulls hovered near the entrance, their eye sockets glowing red as they scanned us, cross-referencing our biometric data against whatever list had been compiled. One by one, we were processed. Verified. Accepted. I stepped off the platform and followed the painted line on the floor, yellow. The color of caution toward doors that had no handles on the outside. Behind me, the transit car departed, taking with it my last connection to the world I'd known. Ahead, the doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, someone was waiting. Re-education began with the removal of identifiers. Not flesh, though it felt just as invasive. The woman waiting inside wore the grey and black uniform of the Adeptus Arbites, though her rank insignia had been filed off, leaving only smooth metal where authority should have been marked. She held a data slate in hands that were more augmetic than organic, fingers clicking softly as she scrolled through information I couldn't see. Designation, she said, without looking up. 7,739 Sigma. I replied, my voice smaller than I'd intended. Click, click, click went her fingers. Confirmed. Proceed to intake chamber 3. Remove all personal effects. Clothing will be provided. I wanted to ask questions. Wanted to demand answers. What had I done? How long would this take? Would I be allowed to contact my work supervisor? But the woman's face was a mask of professional indifference, and I had learned long ago that questions only invited longer delays. I followed the yellow line painted on the floor, my footsteps echoing in corridors that were too clean, too empty, too deliberately designed to make you feel small. The walls were bare, except for devotional scripts written in high Gothic prayers I recognized, but couldn't fully translate. Something about purity through suffering and redemption through compliance. Intake Chamber 3 was a room the size of my hab, furnished with nothing but a metal bench and a disposal chute. A servo skull waited in the corner, its eye sockets dark but somehow still watching. I removed my clothing piece by piece, folding each item carefully before placing it on the bench. My work tunic, stained with years of honest labor. My undershirt, gray and threadbare. My boots, their soles worn smooth from walking the same routes every day for 12 years. When I was naked, I felt the servo skull's attention intensify. It drifted closer, scanning me with beams of red light that crawled across my skin like insects. Temperature, biometrics, searching for augmetics, weapons, concealed identifiers, finding only flesh, marked by a life of compliance. My name was replaced by a sequence. The new designation came via Vox speaker, a voice so flat and processed it might have been synthetic. Subject Re7, 739S intake secundus. Proceed to sanitation. Not even my old number. They'd added prefixes, suffixes, a new taxonomy that placed me somewhere in their system of correction. I repeated it silently, trying to memorize the syllables, but they felt foreign in my mouth. Wrong. The disposal chute opened with a pneumatic hiss. I watched my clothing, everything I'd owned, everything that marked me as a person with a history, slide into darkness and vanish. The servo skull registered this with a soft chirp of approval. Sanitation was a chamber tiled in white ceramic, every surface reflecting harsh lumen light until the room felt infinite. 6 other subjects stood in a line, all naked, all staring straight ahead. I took my place at the end, mimicking their posture, shoulders back, hands at sides, eyes forward. The sprayers activated without warning. The liquid was not water. It burned, not painfully, but wrongly, a chemical sensation that made my skin feel too tight and then too loose. It smelled like hospitals and mortuaries, like something designed to remove not just dirt but identity itself. I kept my eyes closed and my mouth shut, breathing shallowly through my nose while the sprayers worked their way across every centimeter of my body. When it stopped, I was different. Cleaner than I'd ever been, but also somehow less. As if layers had been stripped away that I hadn't known existed. My history compressed into risk metrics and behavioral graphs. After sanitation came examination, a room where Medicae servitors processed us with mechanical efficiency, their augmetic hands cold and precise. They measured my height, weight, bone density, muscle mass. They took blood samples, tissue samples, genetic markers. They scanned my brain activity while showing me images, imperial symbols, heretical symbols, neutral symbols, and recorded my responses with scientific detachment. I tried to respond correctly, to show proper reverence for the aquila and proper disgust for anything that might be corrupt. But I didn't know what correct looked like anymore. The servitors' faces were blank masks, offering no feedback, no indication of whether I was passing or failing tests I didn't understand. Between stations, I caught glimpses of other subjects. The man who'd been on the transit with me, his eyes were already empty, his expression slack. A woman with a port wine birthmark across her face kept whispering prayers under her breath, her lips moving frantically around words I couldn't hear. Another subject, younger than me, had bruises on his wrists that suggested he hadn't come willingly. None of us spoke. Speaking wasn't prohibited, no one had said we couldn't, but the silence felt mandatory, enforced by something heavier than rules. The intake halls echoed with prayers played too loudly to think beneath them. The audio began as we moved into the processing corridor, a space lined with benches where we sat in rows while servo skulls distributed grey jumpsuits. The prayers came through Vox speakers mounted in the ceiling, the volume calibrated to be just below the threshold of pain. You couldn't ignore them, couldn't think past them, could only let them wash over you like the chemical sprayers had. The Emperor protects those who submit to his wisdom. Compliance is devotion. Obedience is love. To question is to stray. To stray is to fall. The Emperor protects those who submit to his wisdom. Over and over, the same phrases, in the same flat tone, layered over each other until individual words lost meaning and became pure texture, a wall of sound that filled every space where thought might exist. I tried to pray along with it, to make the words my own, but my lips wouldn't sync with the rhythm. The prayers came too fast, then too slow, then overlapped until I couldn't tell where one litany ended and another began. The jumpsuit fit poorly, too tight across the shoulders, too loose at the waist, and the fabric felt wrong against my sanitized skin, rough in some places and slick in others. A barcode had been printed on the chest, encoding my new designation in machine-readable format. I traced the lines with my finger, trying to decode them, but the pattern made no sense. I learned quickly that innocence was irrelevant, only correctability mattered. They separated us by category after that. I didn't see the criteria, didn't hear any announcement, but servo skulls descended and marked subjects with colored light: green, yellow, red. I received yellow, the color of caution, the color of uncertainty. Not innocent enough to release, not guilty enough to discard. Somewhere in between, where correction was still possible. The greens were led away first, down a corridor that looked almost pleasant, better lighting, fresher air. I never saw them again. Perhaps they were released after minimal processing. Perhaps it was a mercy. The reds went next, escorted by armored Arbites who gripped their arms with augmetic strength. Those subjects didn't walk so much as were carried, their feet dragging uselessly. One of them looked back at me as they were taken away, and his eyes held a recognition I didn't want to acknowledge. We yellows waited. The process felt less like judgment and more like preparation. An officer approached our group, 15 of us, seated on metal benches bolted to the floor, and began reading from a data slate in a voice that suggested he'd delivered this speech 1,000 times before. You have been identified as subjects requiring cognitive and spiritual realignment. This facility exists to return you to compliance with Imperial standard. The process is mandatory, comprehensive, and documented. Your progress will be monitored continuously. Success means reassignment to productive labor. Failure means escalation to alternative corrective measures. He paused, finally looking up from the slate to scan our faces with eyes that held no warmth, no sympathy, no recognition that we were people rather than problems to be solved. You will be given opportunities to demonstrate correctability. We expect you to use them. The Emperor protects those who deserve protection. The prayers continued overhead, relentless and inescapable. My body learned faster than my mind, flinching at words and tones before meaning arrived. We were led deeper into the facility, down corridors that grew progressively narrower, ceilings that pressed lower, lumen strips that flickered with deliberate irregularity. The architecture itself was designed to unsettle, to make you feel watched from angles that shouldn't exist. Other subjects passed us going the opposite direction, escorted by servitors. They wore different colored jumpsuits, blues, grays, whites, and their faces showed different stages of whatever process we were being subjected to. Some looked merely tired, others looked hollowed out, their eyes tracking movement without recognition, their mouths slack. One man met my gaze as we passed, and I saw something in his expression, a warning, maybe, or just exhausted pity. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Don't fight it. Then he was gone, shuffled away by his servitor escort. We arrived at our dormitory, a long room lined with bunks, 3 levels high, packed so closely together you couldn't stand upright on the upper tiers. 40 bunks for 15 subjects. I didn't understand the excess capacity until I realized more would be coming. This was just the beginning of a cycle that never stopped. Designation Re7739S intake secondus, bunk 37 tier 2, announced a servo skull hovering near my head. I found my assigned space, a metal shelf with a thin mattress, a gray blanket, and a shelf for personal effects I no longer possessed. Above me, someone's feet dangled from tier 3. Below me, a woman lay perfectly still, staring at the underside of my bunk with eyes that didn't blink. Somewhere in the data, my progress was marked as satisfactory. The lights didn't dim that night. There was no night here, just continuous illumination and the endless loop of prayers from speakers I couldn't locate. I lay on my bunk, feeling the rough fabric of the jumpsuit against my sanitized skin, listening to the breathing of 14 other subjects who'd been emptied out and were waiting to be refilled. And I understood. I had been erased. Not killed, not imprisoned, but unmade. My name was gone. My history was compressed into metrics. My body belonged to a system that would document every breath, every heartbeat, every deviation from acceptable parameters. I was no longer a person. I was a subject, and the correction hadn't even begun. Lessons were administered in cycles, each one carefully logged and escalated when I failed to respond appropriately. The first lesson began at what I assumed was morning, though time had become meaningless in a place where the lights never dimmed and the prayers never stopped. A klaxon sounded sharp, piercing, designed to jolt you from whatever shallow sleep you'd managed to achieve. Around me, subjects stirred with mechanical efficiency, their bodies already trained by previous cycles. I was slower, confused, still trying to orient myself when the servo skulls descended, marking stragglers with red scanning beams and harsh vocal warnings. Subject Ray 7739S intake secondus, compliance deviation detected. Corrective notation logged. I scrambled from my bunk, joining the line forming near the dormitory exit. We moved in single file through corridors I didn't recognize, following painted lines that changed color yellow to blue to white, until we arrived at a chamber labeled Instructional Theater 7. The theater was arranged like a lecture hall, tiered seating descending toward a central platform where an instructor waited. She was elderly, her face a network of wrinkles and scars, her eyes augmented with targeting lenses that clicked and whirred as they focused on each of us in turn. "Be seated," she said, her voice amplified by Vox speakers that made it sound like it came from inside my skull. "Today's lesson concerns proper devotional posture. You will learn the 17 sanctioned positions of prayer. You will learn the associated litanies. You will demonstrate mastery before the cycle concludes." Pain was framed as instruction. The positions were impossible. Knees bent at angles that stressed the joints. Spine curved in ways that compressed the lungs. Hands clasped so tightly that circulation stopped and fingers went numb. We were required to hold each position for 5 minutes, while reciting the associated litany without pause, without error, without the slightest deviation from the prescribed words. I failed the first position within 30 seconds. My knees buckled, my lungs couldn't draw enough air to speak clearly, and I stumbled over words in a prayer I'd never been taught. The correction was immediate. A servo skull descended, its mechadendrites extending to touch pressure points along my spine. The sensation wasn't quite pain. The Imperium had long ago perfected methods that stopped short of damage, but it was overwhelming, a neural overload that made every nerve scream without leaving marks. My body convulsed, and I collapsed onto the cold floor, gasping. Subject Re7739S intake secondus has failed to achieve adequate devotional posture, announced the instructor in that same flat tone. Corrective stimulus administered. Resume position 1. Deprivation was correction. Between lessons, we were denied water. Not as punishment, they explained, but as motivation. Thirst sharpened focus, made the body compliant, taught you that comfort was earned through obedience. I watched my fellow subjects lick their lips, saw them swallow reflexively against dry throats, noticed how their movements became more precise as desperation mounted. When we finally achieved the first position correctly, all 15 of us holding it for the full 5 minutes, reciting in perfect unison, water was distributed, not enough to satisfy, just enough to teach us that survival came in measured doses, that the system controlled even our most basic needs. Humiliation was guidance. The second lesson took place in what they called the reflection chamber, a room lined with mirrors that showed you from every angle, every imperfection magnified under harsh lighting. We were made to stand naked while the instructor catalogued our flaws. Subject Re7739S intake secondus. Posture indicates habitual defiance. Muscle development suggests inadequate manual labor history. Skin condition reveals excessive comfort. These deficiencies will be corrected. I wanted to protest that I'd worked 12-hour shifts for 12 years, that my body bore the marks of loyal service, but the mirrors showed me what they saw. Someone soft, uncalloused, unmarked by real suffering. Someone who'd been permitted too much comfort, too much individuality. Someone who needed to be remade. I was told repeatedly that suffering was a mercy compared to execution. The instructors reminded us of this constantly, their voices patient and almost kind as they explained what could have happened instead. We could have been rendered down to protein paste. We could have been lobotomized and converted to servitors. We could have been executed for whatever deviation had flagged us in the system. Instead, we were being given a chance. A gift. The opportunity to prove ourselves worthy of continued existence. My body learned faster than my mind, flinching at words and tones before meaning arrived. By the third cycle, or was it the fourth? The fifth, time had collapsed into endless repetition. My nervous system had begun adapting to the pattern. Certain words triggered automatic responses. Position, recite, demonstrate. My muscles tensing before I consciously registered the command. My heart rate accelerated when I heard the instructor's footsteps, even when I couldn't see her. I learned to anticipate corrections before they were administered. I could feel them coming in the instructor's tone, in the slight pause before a servo skull descended, in the quality of silence that preceded punishment. My body would brace automatically, trying to minimize the neural overload that was coming. This, I realized, was the point. Not to teach specific prayers or postures, but to train compliance at a level below conscious thought. To make obedience instinctive, automatic, faster than reason. The lessons escalated. Position 6 required us to balance on one foot while our arms were extended at precise angles, holding poses that made muscles tremble and joints ache. Position 9 involved pressing our foreheads to the floor while our spines arched backward in ways that felt like they might snap. Position 12 required us to maintain eye contact with the instructor while reciting litanies that described our own unworthiness, our inherent corruption, our desperate need for correction. That one broke people. I watched the woman from my dormitory, the one who'd lain so still beneath my bunk, begin sobbing during position 12. The litany required us to list our failures, real or imagined, to confess inadequacies we might not have known we possessed. She'd been holding together until then, maintaining the blank expression we'd all learned to wear, but something in the words cracked her open. She began listing sins I didn't think she'd actually committed: theft, heresy, impure thoughts, her voice rising to a wail that echoed off the chamber's bare walls. The instructor didn't stop her, didn't comfort or correct, simply watched with those clicking, whirring augmetic eyes while servo skulls recorded everything. When the woman finally collapsed, silent and spent, the instructor made a notation on her data slate. Subject Re 6823T intake secondus demonstrates emotional instability. Recommend escalation to intensive processing. The woman was removed by armored Arbites. I never saw her again. Somewhere in the data, my progress was marked as satisfactory. I knew this because the instructor told me, her voice holding something that might have been approval if it hadn't been so devoid of warmth. Subject Re 7739S intake secundus shows adequate adaptation to curriculum. Neural conditioning responses within acceptable parameters. Emotional regulation improving. Continue current protocol. I should have been relieved. Should have felt grateful that I was passing tests I barely understood. Instead, I felt only a creeping horror at what adequate adaptation meant, that my body had learned to welcome correction, that my mind had begun organizing itself around their system rather than my own thoughts. I was being trained like an animal. And the worst part was that it was working. The cycles continued. New positions, new litanies, new forms of correction when we failed to meet standards that shifted without warning. Sometimes the servo skulls administered neural overload for errors so small I couldn't identify them. Sometimes we were praised for performances that felt identical to ones we'd been punished for earlier. The inconsistency was intentional, I realized. It taught us that we couldn't trust our own judgment, couldn't rely on our understanding of rules or logic. We could only submit completely. Let the system decide what was right. Accept whatever verdict came without question. Between lessons, we returned to the dormitory, where we weren't permitted to speak or interact. We lay on our bunks in silence, listening to the endless prayers, feeling our bodies ache from impossible postures and our minds fragment from continuous correction. I began to lose pieces of myself, not all at once, but gradually, like erosion. Memories of my hab felt distant, uncertain. Had I really lived there for 12 years? Or was that just a story I'd been told? My work at the data processing facility seemed unreal, like something from someone else's life. Even my face, I'd seen it in the reflection chamber mirrors, looked strange to me now, as if I'd never properly known what I looked like. The only thing that felt real was the curriculum. The positions, the litanies, the cycle of instruction and correction and notation. That had structure, meaning, clear parameters. Everything else was fog. I started to crave the lessons, not because I enjoyed them, but because they gave me purpose. Outside the instructional theater, I was nothing, just a body occupying space, waiting for the next cycle. But during lessons, I had a role. I could succeed or fail. I could be measured against a standard. I could matter, even if mattering meant only avoiding correction. By what I thought was the 10th cycle, though it might have been the 20th, I had achieved all 17 positions with adequate precision. My litanies were delivered without error. My body responded to commands before my mind registered them. I had become exactly what they wanted. Compliant, precise, empty of resistance. The instructor made a final notation, her augmetic eyes clicking as they focused on me. Subject Re7739S Intake Secondus has completed Phase 1 of Realignment Curriculum. Recommend advancement to Phase 2. Confessional processing. Subject demonstrates sufficient malleability for deeper intervention. I didn't understand what Phase 2 meant, but my body had already learned to welcome whatever came next. I was ordered to confess, though no crime had ever been specified. Phase 2 began in a room smaller than my old hab, furnished with only 2 chairs facing each other across a metal table. No mirrors this time, no servo skulls, no instructor with augmetic eyes, just a man in a grey uniform with no rank insignia, holding a data slate and wearing an expression of infinite patience. Please be seated, Subject Re7739S Intake Secondus, he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. I am Confessor Facilitator Kane. We will be spending considerable time together. I sat in the chair indicated, its metal cold even through my jumpsuit. The room smelled of disinfectant and something else, old fear, perhaps, absorbed into the walls from countless previous confessions. Confessor Facilitator Kane studied his data slate for a long moment, scrolling through information I couldn't see. My history, probably. My metrics. Every deviation and correction catalogued during Phase 1. Let's begin simply, he said, finally looking up. Tell me why you're here. The question felt like a trap. I'd been summoned without charge, processed without accusation, corrected for failures I couldn't identify. How was I supposed to explain something I didn't understand? I don't know, I said carefully. I received a notice. I complied. Kine made a notation on his slate, the stylus scratching softly. You don't know why the Imperium invested resources in your correction? You believe your summons was arbitrary? No. I caught myself, recognizing the trap too late. Suggesting arbitrariness was questioning Imperial efficiency. I'm certain there was reason. I simply haven't been informed what it is. Another notation. So you acknowledge that you have deviated from acceptable parameters, but you're unable or unwilling to identify the specific deviation. Is that correct? My throat felt dry despite the morning's water ration. I'm willing. I'm not sure what. Let me help you. Kine leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. The Imperium does not make errors. If you were summoned, there was cause. If you cannot identify that cause, it suggests a dangerous lack of self-awareness. Do you understand? They prompted me with categories: thought deviation, emotional excess, insufficient devotion, and waited patiently. Perhaps, Kine continued, you've experienced thoughts that diverged from proper imperial doctrine, not heresy necessarily, but doubts, questions, moments where you found yourself thinking in patterns the administratum would classify as irregular. I wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that my thoughts had always been pure, proper, aligned with imperial truth. But Kine's patient expression suggested he would wait however long necessary for me to arrive at the correct answer. I suppose, I said slowly, everyone has moments of uncertainty. Uncertainty. He repeated the word like he was tasting it, rolling it around his mouth. Describe these moments of uncertainty. I don't, they weren't specific. Just normal human thoughts. Wondering about things. What things? The question hung in the air between us. Outside the room, I could hear the distant hum of machinery, the ever-present prayers from speakers I couldn't see. Inside, there was only silence and Kine's unwavering attention. The usual things, I tried. Work, life, the vastness of the Imperium. The vastness troubles you? No. I only meant it's impressive, awe-inspiring. The scale of the Emperor's domain, but you question whether such scale is necessary, whether the resources devoted to expansion might be better spent on citizen comfort. I never said, you didn't have to say it. The thought occurred, didn't it? Perhaps briefly, perhaps you dismissed it immediately. But it occurred. He was right. Of course he was right. I had thought exactly that, years ago, during a particularly brutal winter when the heating systems failed and we'd been told resources were allocated elsewhere. The thought had lasted maybe 3 seconds before I'd crushed it down. Ashamed, but he knew. Somehow. He knew. Yes, I whispered. Once. But I didn't. Once, that you remember. Kane made another notation. The mind is skilled at self-protection, at hiding thoughts it knows are deviant. Let's explore what else might be hidden. When I hesitated, the penalties returned, harsher and more precise. The servo skulls were back the next session, though I hadn't seen them enter. They flanked Kine's chair like attendants, their eye sockets glowing with that familiar red light. The confessor facilitator's expression remained patient, understanding, but his fingers rested near a control panel I hadn't noticed before. Subject Re7739S intake secundus. We've made progress, he said. You've acknowledged thought deviation, but I sense resistance to deeper exploration. This resistance impedes your correction. I'm not resisting. Let me be clear. His finger moved fractionally closer to the controls. The Imperium requires complete transparency. Partial confession is no confession at all. When I ask about emotional excess, I need specifics. When I inquire about insufficient devotion, I need documentation. Your cooperation determines whether we proceed gently or otherwise. The servo skulls drifted closer, their mechadendrites extending slightly. I'll cooperate, I said quickly. Please. Good. Then let's discuss emotional excess. Have you experienced feelings beyond what is optimal for Imperial service? Everyone feels things. Emotions are human. Informations. Recoming loaders. Immester, unmaken divines. The mechadendrite touched my neck, just below my ear. The neural overload was brief but intensely focused. A spike of sensation that made my vision white out and my body convulse. When it ended, I was gasping, tears streaming down my face without my permission. Inappropriate emotional display, Kine observed, making a notation. You see how excess emotion impairs function? Let's try again. Have you experienced emotional attachments that might compromise your devotion to the Emperor? I began inventing sins simply to make the sessions end. By the 5th session, or the 10th, time had become difficult to track. I understood the pattern. Kine didn't want truth. He wanted confession. The difference was subtle but crucial. Truth was fixed, objective, verifiable. Confession was malleable, could be shaped and expanded until it fit whatever template they were filling. So I gave him what he wanted. Yes, I said, staring at the table rather than his face. I formed an inappropriate attachment to a fellow worker. Designation 4427 theta. I thought about her during work hours. My productivity suffered. None of this was true. My productivity had never suffered. But the lie felt safer than silence. Kai's stylus scratched. Describe the attachment. I watched her. Wanted to speak with her. Imagined conversations we might have had. Did you act on these impulses? No. But you wanted to. Yes. And you recognize this as emotional excess that compromised your devotion to the Emperor? Yes. Good. Another notation. What else? So, I invented more. Told him about doubts I'd never had, resentments I'd never felt, moments of insufficient devotion that were pure fabrication. I confessed to questioning the ecclesiarchy's teachings, to feeling envy toward those with better rations, to experiencing pride in my work performance, pride being a sin that suggested I valued my own worth above the Imperium's needs. Each confession was recorded, believed, and used to justify the next correction. The sessions grew longer. Cain would return to previous confessions, asking for elaboration, finding inconsistencies in stories I'd made up on the spot. The servo skulls administered corrections when my details didn't align, when my emotional responses seemed insufficient, when I failed to show adequate shame for the sins I'd invented. I learned to be consistent. Learned to track my own lies. To build a coherent narrative of deviation, even though none of it had actually happened. The fictional version of myself, prideful, emotionally excessive, spiritually inadequate, became more real than the person I'd actually been. That person was gone anyway. I couldn't remember him clearly anymore. You're making progress, Cain told me during what I thought was the 15th session. Your self-awareness has improved significantly. You've identified multiple deviation patterns and shown genuine remorse. Genuine remorse for things I'd never done. Shame for sins I'd invented to satisfy his need for confession. However, he continued, there's still resistance. I can sense it. A core of self that hasn't been properly examined. I've told you everything. No. His voice remained gentle, patient, but his finger moved toward the controls. You've told me what you think I want to hear. That's different from truth. That's manipulation, which is itself a form of deviation. The servo skulls moved closer. The Imperium requires absolute honesty, Cain said. Not performances of honesty, but the real thing. Shall we try again? I began to understand that there was no correct answer. No confession sufficient to end the process. Whatever I said would be documented, analyzed, and found wanting. The sessions would continue until I broke in some way Cain recognized as genuine, until the performance of confession became indistinguishable from actual belief, until I truly believed I was deviant, corrupt, in need of correction. I don't know what you want, I whispered. I want you to want correction, Cain replied. Not because you fear punishment, but because you recognize your own inadequacy. Can you do that? I looked at him, this man with infinite patience and a control panel that could unmake my nervous system, and I felt something crack inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a small fracture, a hairline split in whatever foundation had been holding me together. Yes, I said, and I almost meant it. Yes, I'm inadequate, I'm flawed, I need correction. Cain smiled for the first time since we'd met. It wasn't a kind smile. Exactly. But it held satisfaction. Good, he said, making what I somehow knew was a final notation. You're ready for Phase 3. I didn't ask what Phase 3 entailed. My body had already learned not to ask questions. Eventually, they showed me improvement charts bearing my designation, proof that the process was working. Phase 3 took place in a different chamber, larger than the confession room but still windowless, still saturated with that smell of disinfectant and fear. The walls were covered with picked screens, displaying data I was beginning to recognize. Neural response curves, behavioral compliance metrics, devotional sincerity ratings measured in percentages and color-coded graphs. My graph was yellow trending toward green. Improvement, according to the metrics. Progress toward acceptable parameters. Confessor facilitator Kaini stood beside a larger display, using a laser pointer to highlight specific data points as he spoke. His voice had lost some of its previous patience, replaced by something almost like professional pride. Subject Re7739S intake secundus. Observe your trajectory over the past 23 cycles. Neural conditioning response time has decreased by 47%. Emotional regulation variance has narrowed to within 2 standard deviations of optimal. Confessional transparency has achieved 83% authenticity rating. I stared at the numbers, trying to understand what they meant about me. The person those metrics described was efficient, compliant, properly calibrated, a good citizen, a corrected citizen. You should feel encouraged, Kane continued. Many subjects require twice this many cycles to reach your current level. You're demonstrating exceptional malleability. Exceptional malleability. The phrase should have horrified me. Instead, I felt a small, shameful spark of pride quickly crushed, because pride was deviation, and I'd been corrected enough to recognize my own deviant impulses. Or had I? Was crushing the pride genuine self-correction, or just another performance? The uncertainty made my head ache. I spoke the right phrases without prompting and wept on schedule during sanctioned sermons. The sermons were daily now. Mandatory attendance in the facility's chapel, a vast chamber lined with statues of saints whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of fearful worship. We knelt on cold stone for hours, while servo skulls circled overhead, recording our devotional responses, measuring the sincerity of our prayers through biometric analysis. The priest was ancient, his voice amplified through vox speakers until it sounded like the voice of the emperor himself, terrible and absolute and inescapable. He spoke of humanity's inherent corruption, of the constant vigilance required to maintain purity, of the mercy shown to those who accepted their own inadequacy. I wept during these sermons, not always, but often enough. The tears came without conscious decision, triggered by certain phrases or tonal shifts I'd learned to recognize. Unworthy flesh, and my eyes would sting. The emperor's infinite patience, and something in my chest would constrict painfully. The first time it happened, I'd been startled by my own response. The 20th time, I'd stopped questioning it. By now, I simply accepted that my body knew when to weep, that tears had become another form of compliance my nervous system had automated. After each sermon, servo skulls would descend to scan our faces, measuring tear composition, heart rate elevation, pupil dilation. Those who wept adequately received a small ration increase. Those who failed to show sufficient emotion received additional correctional sessions. I always wept adequately now. The instructors praised my compliance in flat, toneless voices. Subject Re7739S intake secundus demonstrates satisfactory devotional posture. Subject Re7739S intake secundus has achieved optimal prayer recitation cadence. Subject Re7739S intake secundus shows acceptable shame response to confessional prompts. The praise came frequently now, delivered by instructors, facilitators, and the servo skulls recorded messages. Each compliment was documented, added to my file, used to justify the continued investment in my correction. I should have felt relief, should have celebrated each small approval as proof that I was succeeding, that the end of this nightmare was approaching. But the praise felt hollow. Not because it was insincere, the instructors meant what they said, assessed me against objective metrics, but because the person they were praising wasn't me. It was a construct, a carefully assembled collection of correct responses and appropriate emotions, a performance so thorough that it had replaced the performer. I felt hollowed out, but the absence was labeled stability. In the reflection sessions we had those daily now, part of Phase 3's maintenance protocol, I studied my own face in the mirror and barely recognized it. The features were the same. Same eyes, same nose, same jawline that had belonged to whoever I'd been before. But the expression was different, softer, more compliant. The eyes held less curiosity and more acceptance. I looked peaceful, the way corpses look peaceful. Your emotional baseline has normalized, the reflection instructor told me, standing beside my mirror image. The volatility we observed during intake has been successfully corrected. You're approaching optimal psychological configuration. Optimal psychological configuration. I repeated the phrase silently, trying to understand what it meant to be optimally configured. Was I happier? No. Was I more functional? Perhaps. I completed tasks without hesitation, recited prayers without conscious thought, wept and smiled and expressed shame exactly when required. I had become exactly what they wanted. Compliant, precise, empty of resistance, but in the quiet moments increasingly rare. But they still existed. I could feel the absence where something used to be. Curiosity, maybe, or desire, or the simple sense that my thoughts belonged to me rather than to a system that had reprogrammed them. I was no longer myself, but I was finally acceptable. The breakthrough came during a session with Kaine, though I'm not sure if breakthrough is the right word. Collapse, perhaps. Surrender. The moment when resistance became literally unthinkable. Tell me, Kaine said, his voice carrying that familiar patient tone. Who are you? I opened my mouth to respond with my designation, the alphanumeric string that had replaced my name, but he raised a hand to stop me. No, not your designation. Who are you? What defines you? The question felt like a trap, but everything felt like a trap now. I searched for an answer that wouldn't trigger correction, that would satisfy whatever metric Kaine was measuring. I'm a servant of the Imperium. I tried. All citizens are servants. What makes you distinct? Nothing, I said, and realized it was true. Nothing makes me distinct. I'm a unit, a component. I exist to serve optimal function. Kaine smiled, that same satisfied expression from our earlier sessions. Say it again. I'm nothing distinct. I'm a unit designed to serve optimal function. How do you feel about that? I searched my emotional landscape, trying to identify what I felt. Relief, fear, shame, but the feelings were muted, distant, like signals from a dying star reaching me long after the source had burned out. Grateful, I said finally, and meant it. I'm grateful to have been corrected, to have been shown my purpose. Kaine made his notation with what might have been reverence. Subject Re7-739S, intake secondus, has achieved core identity realignment. Recommend advancement to final phase, reintegration preparation. I didn't feel victorious. Didn't feel anything except a vast, echoing emptiness where myself used to be. But the emptiness was stable, sustainable. It wouldn't cause problems or ask questions or deviate from acceptable parameters. The improved metrics bore witness. I was corrected. I was functional. I was ready to be returned to service, to spend whatever remained of my life, performing whatever function the Imperium assigned, without complaint, without hesitation, without the troublesome burden of individual thought. They had saved me from myself, and I was grateful. Emperor, help me. I was genuinely grateful. Re-education concluded not with freedom, but reassignment. The final session was perfunctory, administrative. Kaine sat across from me with his data slate, reviewing my completed metrics one last time before authorizing my transfer. His expression held neither warmth nor coldness, just professional satisfaction at a task completed adequately. Subject, Re7-739S intake secundus, you have successfully completed cognitive and spiritual realignment. Your progress has been documented and filed with the appropriate authorities. You are hereby cleared for reintegration into Imperial service. He paused, studying me with those patient eyes that had witnessed my complete dissolution. Do you understand what this means? Yes, Confessor Facilitator. My voice was steady, empty of inflection. I have been corrected. I am ready to serve. And you accept your reassignment without reservation? I accept whatever assignment the Imperium deems appropriate. Another notation. The last one. Good. Report to Processing Bay 3 for reassignment, briefing and transport authorization. He stood, preparing to dismiss me, but hesitated. For the first time since we'd met, Something almost human flickered across his face, not quite concern, but perhaps curiosity. Subject, Re7739S. Do you have any questions? I searched my mind for questions, for any remaining spark of curiosity or resistance. Found nothing but smooth, empty compliance. No. Confessor facilitator. I have no questions. He nodded, unsurprised. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects, I echoed, and meant it with the entirety of what remained of me. I was deemed fit for a new labor tier, where obedience mattered more than initiative. The reassignment briefing was conducted by an administratum clerk whose augmetic jaw clicked as he spoke, reading from a parchment scroll that probably predated my birth. Designation Re7739S reintegration approved. You are assigned to Manufactorum Complex Delta 9. Subsector 12 Tertius. Labor classification. Compliance monitor. Grade 3. You will oversee worker productivity, report deviations, and maintain devotional standards among the labor cohort under your supervision. The assignment made perfect sense. They had broken me down and rebuilt me as a tool for breaking others. I would spend whatever remained of my life watching for the same small deviations that had marked me, the same thought crimes and emotional excesses, reporting them so others could be corrected as I had been. I would become part of the mechanism that had consumed me. Do you accept this assignment? Yes. Sign here. He pushed forward a data slate covered in dense legal text I didn't bother reading. I pressed my thumb to the authentication pad, watched it glow green as it confirmed my biometric signature. Transport leaves in 2 hours. Collect your issued materials from distribution and report to Bay 7. The world outside the facility looked unchanged, yet I moved through it like a ghost rehearsing lines. The transit back to the hive was the same route I'd taken when I arrived, though how long ago that had been, I couldn't say. Weeks? Months? The facility had existed outside normal time, and re-entry into the world of schedules and shifts felt disorienting. I sat in the same rusted transit car, surrounded by the same type of workers traveling to and from their assignments. They looked exhausted, beaten down by Imperial service, but their eyes still held something I recognized as self. They were people, however diminished. They still had that spark of individuality the Imperium tolerated, because fully extinguishing it required resources better spent elsewhere. I had no such spark. I was hollow, optimized, a shell performing the functions it had been programmed to perform. No one looked at me directly. Perhaps they sensed what I'd become. Perhaps some instinct warned them that I was contagious, that my emptiness might spread to them if they acknowledged it. Or perhaps I was imagining persecution where there was only the usual Imperial indifference. Subsector 12 Tertius was similar to my original subsector: grey corridors, flickering lumen strips, the distant grinding of machinery. But it wasn't home. I had no home. Home implied attachment. And attachment was deviation. I was simply present, functional, ready to perform my assigned duties. My new hab was identical to my old one. Same dimensions, same furniture, same tin aquila on the wall. I unpacked the few items I'd been issued: a compliance monitor's badge, a data slate for filing reports, a copy of the regulations regarding labor, oversight and devotional standards, and a new jumpsuit grey, but with a thin red stripe along the sleeves indicating my new classification. I hung the jumpsuit in the narrow closet and sat on the edge of the cot, waiting for the shift start klaxon that would signal my first day in this new role. Every sensation carried a faint echo of correction. When I ate my ration of nutrient paste that evening, I tasted not just the bland protein but also the memory of deprivation, the cycles when food had been withheld to sharpen my focus, to teach me that survival was earned through compliance. The paste tasted like obedience. When I lay down to sleep, the cot's thin mattress pressed against my spine in ways that echoed the impossible positions I'd been forced to hold during Phase 1. My muscles remembered those lessons, still carried the neural pathways that had been carved through repetition and correction. When I closed my eyes, I heard the prayers. Not the actual prayers, the hab was quieter than the facility, The Vox speakers less intrusive, but the phantom prayers my mind had learned to generate, filling silences with approved thoughts so that dangerous ideas couldn't take root. I understood then that re-education never truly ends. The facility had released my body but kept my mind. Every thought I had was filtered through their framework, every emotion measured against their metrics, every impulse checked against the possibility of deviation. I was my own overseer now, monitoring myself with the same ruthless efficiency I would soon apply to others. The system had become internalized, self-sustaining, perfect. My first shift as compliance monitor began at the sound of the klaxon, harsh, mechanical, designed to jolt you from sleep into immediate functionality. I dressed in my new uniform, attached my badge, collected my data slate, and reported to Manufactorum Complex Delta 9. The complex was vast, larger than any single facility I'd worked in before. Thousands of workers processing thousands of tons of raw material into components that would be shipped to forge worlds I would never see, assembled into weapons for wars I would never understand, deployed by soldiers whose names would never be recorded. My role was simple. Observe, document, report. I walked among the workers, watching for signs of deviation. A worker who moved too slowly, another who paused too long between tasks, someone whose devotional recitation lacked proper enthusiasm, a woman who made eye contact with a fellow worker in a way that suggested emotional attachment. Each observation went into my data slate. Each notation would be reviewed, cross-referenced, analyzed. Workers who accumulated sufficient deviations would receive notices. They would be summoned. They would be corrected. As I had been corrected, I felt nothing as I made these notations. No guilt, no satisfaction, no moral conflict. These were simply functions I performed, metrics I maintained, my contribution to the Imperium's optimal operation. The workers avoided me, learned quickly to recognize my red-striped uniform, to adjust their behavior when I passed. Some tried to appear more devoted, reciting prayers louder, working faster. Others simply went blank, performing their minimum required functions with mechanical precision, offering me nothing to report. I reported them anyway. Excessive devotion suggested performance rather than genuine faith. Mechanical precision suggested emotional suppression rather than true compliance. Everything was potentially deviation. Everything required documentation. By the end of my first week, I had filed 63 reports. By the end of my first month, 7 workers had been summoned for re-education. I never learned whether they returned. The ghost rehearsing lines moved through the days without deviation, without question, without the burden of consciousness that might have recognized what it had become. I was useful. I was functional. I was exactly what the Imperium needed me to be. And in the quiet moments, those brief spaces between sleep and waking, between one shift and the next, I sometimes felt an echo of something that might have been grief. But grief was emotional excess. So I documented it in my personal compliance log, noted the deviation, and crushed it down until it disappeared into the empty space where myself used to be. When I faltered, hesitating before a prayer, pausing too long in silence, the alarms were immediate. It happened during morning devotionals, 3 months into my new assignment. The shift had assembled in the Manufactorum's chapel, a crude space carved into the factory floor, barely large enough for the 100 workers under my supervision. We knelt on cold metal grating while the Vox speakers played the standard litanies. I knew the prayers perfectly, had recited them thousands of times, the words carved into my neural pathways through repetition and correction. My mouth should have moved automatically, forming sounds without conscious thought. But something caught. A single syllable stuck in my throat. Emperor came out wrong, too quiet. The emphasis in the wrong place. A hesitation of perhaps half a second. No one else would have noticed. The workers around me continued their recitations without pause, their voices blending into the mechanical drone of proper devotion. But the servo skull monitoring my sector noticed. Its eye sockets flared red. A soft chirp, barely audible over the prayers, indicated that data had been logged, analyzed, flagged as deviation. I felt my heart rate spike. My palms grow damp. Ancient fear responses that my body remembered even when my mind had been emptied. I continued the prayer, forcing my voice back into proper cadence. But the damage was done. The system had noticed. The system never forgot. Reports were filed, thresholds breached, and my designation was flagged once more. The notice arrived that evening, slipped into my ration queue just as the first one had. Same heavy paper, same dark ink, same bureaucratic courtesy, masking absolute command. Designation Ray 7739S reintegration approved is hereby summoned for maintenance evaluation at re-educational facility Secunda 7. Report within 12 hours. Previous correction protocols remain in effect. The Emperor protects. I stared at the paper, feeling something that might have been panic if panic hadn't been conditioned out of me. Instead, I felt only a dull recognition of inevitability. The system had detected regression. The system would apply corrective measures. This was logical, necessary, proper. I was not angry or afraid, only tired, so tired. The kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical, settling into whatever remained of my soul like sediment. I had done everything correctly, had monitored myself with ruthless precision, crushed every deviation before it could fully form, performed my duties without complaint or hesitation, and still, I had failed. One moment of imperfection, one half-second pause, and all the correction, all the emptying, all the careful reconstruction insufficient. The system had no patience for regression, only for repeated processing. I reported to the facility within the required time frame, traveling the same transit route, walking the same corridors. But this time, there was no uncertainty, no hope that this might be a mistake or misunderstanding. I knew exactly what waited for me. The intake process was abbreviated. They already had my records, my complete correction history, my detailed psychological profile. A different clerk, this one entirely augmetic, more machine than human, processed me with mechanical efficiency. Regression event documented. Maintenance protocol initiated. Proceed to holding cell 7. The holding cell was smaller than the dormitory I'd stayed in before. A single metal bench, a drain in the floor, walls that pressed close enough to touch with outstretched arms, no windows, no Vox speakers, just silence, and the distant hum of the facility's machinery. I sat on the bench and waited. Hours passed. Or days. Time dissolved in that silence. Unmeasured and unmeasurable. I tried to maintain the proper mental discipline, reciting prayers, reviewing compliance protocols, keeping my thoughts organized according to approved patterns. But in that silence, things began to surface. Thoughts I'd believed were erased. Memories I'd thought were gone. The face of the person I'd been before, correction not clearly, but in fragments. The sound of my birth name, almost inaudible beneath layers of designation and erasure. The sensation of curiosity, that dangerous impulse to ask why. I realized I was more valuable as a lesson than as a person. When Confessor Facilitator Kine finally arrived, he looked older than I remembered. Or perhaps I was seeing him clearly for the first time, without the fog of compliance obscuring my perception. Subject Re7739S reintegration approved, he said, settling into a chair that had been brought for him. Your regression is disappointing but not unexpected. Approximately 37% of corrected subjects experience some form of relapse within the first 6 months of reintegration. He consulted his data slate, scrolling through information with practiced ease. The data suggests that complete erasure of self is more difficult than initial correction estimates indicated. The human mind is stubborn. It clings to identity even when identity serves no useful function. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. No defense, no explanation that would matter. Tell me. Kine continued, his voice carrying that familiar patience. What were you thinking when you hesitated during devotionals? The honest answer was that I didn't know. The hesitation had come from somewhere below conscious thought, from some fragment of self that had survived the correction and waited for a moment of weakness to resurface. But honesty was dangerous. Honesty revealed how incomplete my correction had been. I was thinking nothing, I said. It was a physical failure. Fatigue, perhaps. Not ideological deviation. Kine made a notation. his expression unchanged. Subject attempts to minimize regression event. Claims physical causation rather than psychological. This suggests incomplete internalization of correction protocols. He looked up from his slate, meeting my eyes with that terrible, patient gaze. We can correct this. The protocols for regression are well established. More intensive than initial correction, but effective. You'll lose more, of course. More memories, more of whatever you still think of as self. But you'll emerge more stable, more sustainable, more empty, he meant. More thoroughly hollowed out, with deeper safeguards against the possibility of individual thought. However, he continued, there is an alternative. I felt something tighten in my chest, not quite hope, but attention. Your regression, while regrettable, makes you valuable for training purposes. Other compliance monitors need to recognize early warning signs in themselves and others. Your case could serve as instructional material, a living example of how even corrected subjects remain vulnerable. He paused, studying my reaction. You would undergo partial reprocessing, enough to stabilize your compliance, but not so much that you lose the ability to articulate your experiences. You would then serve as a training subject, demonstrating regression patterns to new monitors, helping us refine our detection protocols. A life spent being examined, being documented, being used as a cautionary tale for others who might stumble as I had stumbled. The choice is yours, Kaine said, though we both knew it wasn't really a choice. Complete reprocessing, or continued usefulness as an instructional subject. I looked at him, this man who had unmade me once and was prepared to do it again, who saw my suffering as data to be analyzed and optimized, and I felt the last fragments of resistance crumble into dust. I accept the second option, I said. I will serve as instructional material, not because I wanted to preserve what remained of myself, not because I feared deeper correction, but because the system had decided I was more valuable as a lesson than as a person. And I had been so thoroughly corrected that I accepted the system's valuation of my worth. Kaine smiled that satisfied smile. Excellent. Your cooperation will be documented and credited to your permanent record. Report to Training Wing Delta for processing. As I stood to leave, he added one final note. Subject Ray 7739S demonstrates appropriate acceptance of reduced status. Prognosis. Stable utility as educational resource. Recommended duration. Indefinite. Indefinite. I would spend the rest of my life as a warning. A cautionary tale told in training sessions. My every failure documented and analyzed. My regression examined by countless future monitors who would learn from my weakness. I was no longer even a person. I was a lesson the Imperium taught to itself. And I was grateful for the opportunity to serve. Emperor, help me. I was still grateful. In the final stage, there was no classroom, only a chair and a mask that smelled of disinfectant and old breath. Training Wing Delta was not what I'd expected. No lecture halls, no observation chambers where trainees might watch my regression from behind protective glass. Just a small room, clinical, white. Every surface smooth and seamless, furnished with a single chair bolted to the floor. The chair had restraints. I stared at them for a long moment, understanding crystallizing slowly through the fog of compliance that still clouded my thoughts. This wasn't about using me as a speaking example, allowing me to articulate my experiences to future monitors. This was something else, something more invasive. Subject, Re7739S training designation, please be seated. The voice came from a Vox speaker I couldn't locate, synthetic and emotionless. I sat. The restraints closed automatically around my wrists and ankles, not painful, but absolutely secure. I tested them once, a reflexive gesture, and found no give at all. A figure entered through a door I hadn't noticed. Not Kaine this time, but someone new. A biologist adept, their face mostly hidden behind rebreather apparatus, their hands encased in surgical gloves that gleamed under the harsh lighting. They carried a case containing instruments I couldn't identify, smooth metal and blinking lights and cables that writhed slightly, as if alive. Subject Re7739S training designation. They said, their voice filtered through the rebreather, until it sounded insectoid. You have been selected for neural encoding protocol. This will ensure permanent compliance while preserving cognitive function sufficient for instructional purposes. I felt my heart rate spike. I was told I would serve as training material. That I would help teach. You will. The adept moved behind me, and I felt cold fingers touching my scalp, measuring, marking points with something that stung slightly. But verbal instruction is inefficient. Subject memory is unreliable. We will extract your correction experience directly, encode it for educational distribution, ensure that every monitor in this sector has access to your complete regression profile. They told me this would ensure permanent compliance, a kindness to both me and the Imperium. The mask descended before I could process what was happening. It covered my entire face, nose, mouth, eyes, sealing against my skin with a soft hiss. The smell hit me immediately. Disinfectant trying and failing to mask something organic and wrong, like breath exhaled by someone who'd been dead for days. Panic surged, primal and immediate. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe properly through the mask's filters, couldn't move against the restraints. My body thrashed uselessly, ancient survival instincts overriding years of conditioning. Sedation administered, the adept announced calmly. I felt the prick of a needle in my neck, and the panic began to dissolve, replaced by a creeping numbness that spread through my limbs like frost. Subject will remain conscious for the encoding process. This ensures data integrity. Please try to relax, relax. As if relaxation were possible while they carved into my mind. I felt pressure against my temples, not painful, but deeply wrong. A sensation of intrusion that my body recognized as violation even when my corrected mind couldn't form the thought. Something was entering my skull, bypassing bone and membrane, reaching directly into the tissue where my thoughts were stored. As sensation faded, I felt gratitude programmed where resistance once lived. The extraction began. They pulled memories from me like thread from a spool, each one examined and catalogued before being encoded for distribution. I experienced my own correction again, but from outside myself, watching, as if it were happening to someone else, someone I'd once been. I saw myself receiving the first summons, felt the fear and confusion as data rather than emotion. I watched my name being replaced by designation, observed my own face going blank as the person behind it was systematically erased. I experienced every prayer, every impossible position, every moment of neural correction compressed into pure information. The process was clinical, thorough. But alongside the extraction, something else was happening. With each memory they pulled, they replaced it with something new. Not different memories that would be inefficient, but the same memories recontextualized, reframed, encoded with the proper emotional response. Fear became gratitude. Resistance became acceptance. Every moment of suffering was rewritten as necessary correction. Every violation recast as mercy. I felt my mind being rebuilt in real time. Each synapse adjusted. Each neural pathway optimized for maximum compliance. The parts of me that had survived initial correction, those stubborn fragments that had caused my regression, were located, isolated, and systematically eliminated. My fate was sealed not in blood, but in approval stamps. Hours passed. Or days. The sedation made time meaningless, turned the process into a single extended moment of dissolution and reconstruction. Through it all, I remained conscious, aware of what was being done but unable to resist, unable even to want to resist. The gratitude they were programming felt real, more real than the fading memories of whoever I'd been before. The gratitude was solid, permanent, carved into my neural architecture at a level below conscious thought. I was grateful for the chair, grateful for the mask, grateful for the adept's careful hands as they unmade and remade me, grateful for the Imperium's infinite patience with subjects like me who required repeated correction. The gratitude was everything. It filled the spaces where doubt might have lived, where questions might have formed, where resistance might have taken root. When the mask was finally removed, I gasped air that tasted like purification. The restraints opened. The adept stepped back, studying their work with professional satisfaction. Encoding complete. Subject neural configuration permanently stabilized. Regression probability reduced to 0.03%. Subject Re-7739S training designation is cleared for indefinite instructional service. I stood on legs that barely supported me, my body weak from however long I'd been in that chair. But my mind felt clear, clearer than it had ever been. Every thought moved along approved pathways, every emotion aligned with optimal parameters. Every impulse served the Imperium's function. I was re-educated at last completely, and forever. They assigned me to a display chamber in the facility's training wing. Not a cell's implied punishment, and I was no longer being punished. This was service, honor, the privilege of helping future monitors avoid my mistakes. The chamber had a window one-way glass through which trainees could observe me. A Vox link allowed them to ask questions, which I would answer with perfect honesty, perfect clarity, perfect compliance. Subject Re-7739S. Describe your initial deviation. I experienced unauthorized emotional attachment to a co-worker. I allowed personal desires to interfere with optimal function. I was correctly identified as requiring correction. Subject Re-7739S. Describe your regression event. I hesitated during devotional recitation due to insufficient internalization of correction protocols. The system appropriately detected this deviation and applied necessary maintenance procedures. Subject Re-7739S. What advice would you give to new monitors? Document everything. Trust the system absolutely. Recognize that individual thought is deviation. Embrace correction as mercy. The questions came daily, sometimes multiple times per shift. Different trainees, different instructors, but always the same answers. My responses were perfect because they were true, not performed truth, but genuine belief encoded directly into my neural pathways. I no longer remembered my birth name. Couldn't recall what my hab had looked like before correction. What my life had been. Who I'd been. Those memories had been extracted, encoded, distributed to training archives throughout the sector. Other people knew my story better than I did now. They could access my complete correction history, experience my suffering as educational material, learn from my failures without risking their own compliance. I was a lesson, a warning, a tool, and I was content. Not happy happiness was emotional excess, but content. Satisfied that I served a function, that my existence had meaning within the Imperium's vast machinery. I had been corrected, and correction was mercy, and mercy was love, and love was obedience, and obedience was all that remained. Sometimes, in the brief moments between questions, I would catch my reflection in the one-way glass. The person looking back was serene, peaceful, empty of conflict. Their eyes held no depth, no curiosity, no trace of whatever had once made them individual. They looked perfect. I looked perfect. We were the same person now, the observed and the observer, the lesson and the warned, the corrected and the correcting. All boundaries had dissolved, all distinctions had been erased. There was only service, only function, only the grateful acceptance of having been unmade and remade into something useful. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects those who surrender completely. The Emperor protects those who become exactly what he needs them to be, without question, without hesitation, without the burden of self. I was protected. I was corrected. I was forever.